New Mexico is a beautiful state. The land of enchantment, as it turns out, is quite enchanting. But while New Mexico has grown fairly consistently over the last 100 years, its neighboring state, Arizona, has grown multiple times more over the same time period. Here's why so many Americans move to Arizona and not New Mexico. Hello and welcome to Geography by Geoff. Today we're off to the Great Southwest to look at two states in particular and how they've grown over the last century. New Mexico and Arizona have quite the entangled history as it turns out. But while Arizona has grown by an incredible amount, New Mexico simply hasn't. Which is crazy, because New Mexico is simply beautiful. And this is to take nothing away from Arizona, but the discrepancy between the two states is actually pretty jarring. But of course, as usual, if you enjoy my videos, be sure to check out my podcast, Geography is Everything. Each week, myself and Professor Hunter Shobi tackle a wildly different topic and look at them through a geographic lens. This week, we're going to explore the humble potato. You can listen to that podcast right here on YouTube, Substack where there's exclusive content, or whatever app you use. From the very beginning, the histories of Arizona and New Mexico have been intertwined. And much like its name suggests, New Mexico was once part of Mexico proper. In fact, not only was New Mexico part of the current country of Mexico, but so too were the modern-day states of Texas, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, California, much of Colorado, and a sliver of Wyoming. The vast majority of this territory was won by the United States during the Mexican-American War with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. The remainder of what would become the contiguous United States was purchased from Mexico in 1854 in order to build a southern transcontinental rail. This entire region in between the newly minted states of California and Texas would become the New Mexico Territory. Now, as with many states and territories during this period of time, the New Mexico Territory would get wrapped up in the US Civil War, where it was constantly debated on whether it would be entered into the Union as a slave state or as a free state. In fact, both the Union and Confederates claimed the territory under their respective banners. The Union would eventually win the territory, but the Confederates, based in Texas, would continue to claim the southern part of the territory and march under a different flag and name entirely, Arizona. And despite the current incarnation of the two states, the Confederates actually cut the territory into a northern half and a southern half, of which they claimed the southern half for which they believed would become the Confederate state of Arizona. Of course, Arizona and New Mexico don't look like this today. Shortly after the war ended in 1865, the reunited US government would sort out the territory into the New Mexico Territory in the east and the Arizona Territory in the west. The northwest portion of the New Mexico Territory would also be given to Nevada, which was admitted into the Union in 1864. And Colorado would take the northeast portion. It would be another 47 years before New Mexico or Arizona would be admitted into the Union as a full state. But the original intent was that New Mexico would be entered into the full state much sooner than 1912. In 1888, President Grover Cleveland proposed admitting the territory into the country along with Washington, Montana, and Dakota, but would lose that battle due to shifting political winds. But even in 1888, New Mexico wasn't a place to be considered for statehood for many years prior. Nevada, for example, was entered into the Union with less than 10,000 people living in it. At that time, New Mexico had nearly 100,000 people, but most of those people were former Mexican citizens. And US politicians had no intention of regarding them on an equal level as American settlers to Nevada. Arizona, it should be pointed out, would be excluded from statehood for similar reasons. New Mexico would ultimately be admitted to the state on January 6, 1912, and Arizona would be admitted shortly after on February 14, 1912. And during this time of admittance, New Mexico would have nearly 330,000 people living in it, while Arizona would have just over 200,000 people. This is a far cry from where the two states are today. New Mexico and Arizona share a unified history. Even after they were split up as separate territories, they remained linked for a long time. But beginning in the mid-1900s, something started happening. Arizona began pulling away from New Mexico. And there's a reason for that. But before we get into why so many Americans move to Arizona and not New Mexico, if you're enjoying this video, now would be a great time to subscribe. More fun geography videos are just a single click away. As already mentioned, New Mexico would start out its life as a state with far more people than Arizona. But it wouldn't take too long before this starts to change. By 1950, Arizona begins to outpace New Mexico handily with over 750,000 people to New Mexico's 680,000. And from there, the gap just gets wider. And this is interesting because, from the outside, the two states look pretty similar. mostly because both are predominantly dry arid deserts aside from specific areas. And this leads us to our likely number one reason for the two's relative growth: water. It might seem odd that two mostly desert states would have a huge difference in the amount of water available, but that is actually the case here. You see, Arizona is fed by multiple different water sources, but a large part of its water comes from the Colorado River, a river that also feeds the states of Colorado, Nevada, Wyoming, California, and New Mexico, but just a smidge. And in this equation, Arizona gets a sizable portion of the Colorado River, delivered by an extensive aqueduct. Meanwhile, New Mexico's largest river that goes through it is the Rio Grande. But the Rio Grande is much smaller than the Colorado River, and New Mexico doesn't get it all. In fact, New Mexico and Texas had been locked in a legal battle over who has access to the majority of the river's water until very recently. But also, these two rivers are not equal. The Colorado River has an average discharge of about 22,500 cubic feet of water per second, and the Rio Grande has an average discharge of about 2,400 cubic feet per second, which means that there is flatly less water for New Mexico to use for things like agriculture. And especially in the early part of the 20th century, agriculture was a huge economic generator. If your state wasn't able to grow as much, fewer people would move there overall. This, of course, is no longer the case today, but it had knock-on effects. As Arizona was able to grow its agricultural industry, it attracted additional people to support the increase in population. This would directly lead to the city of Phoenix outpacing New Mexico's largest city, Albuquerque, in almost every industry. But there's also another thing at play here. As we've already mentioned, Arizona and New Mexico share a mostly dry, arid climate throughout the state. But despite this similarity, the two states' weather systems are actually quite different. You see, New Mexico exists at an average elevation of around 5,000 feet above sea level, and its largest city, Albuquerque, is at 5,300 feet above sea level. If we contrast this to Arizona, the differences start to emerge. While Arizona's average elevation is still a relatively high 4,000 feet above the sea level, Phoenix has managed to grow in a valley that's much lower. Phoenix, home to millions of Arizonans, is just over 1,200 feet of elevation, and this has had a huge impact on the relative comfort for people living there. What this basically boils down to is that while both Phoenix and Albuquerque get quite hot in the summer, in the winter, Albuquerque gets much colder. The average low during the fall and winter months can range anywhere between the low 40s all the way down to the low teens. Phoenix, meanwhile, stays at a relatively comfortable temperature throughout winter. And this means that people who are fleeing from the colder northern cities, also called snowbirds, have inevitably chosen Phoenix and Arizona as their destination rather than Albuquerque or New Mexico at large. Today, New Mexico has a population just over 2.1 million people, making it the 36th largest state overall. Meanwhile, Arizona has over 7.3 million people, making it the 14th largest state. That's nearly 3.5 times the size of New Mexico, and this has trickled down throughout both states. Phoenix has nearly 5 million people in its metro area and has attracted an industry and economy to match, as well as major league sports teams in 4 of the 5 major leagues in the US. Meanwhile, Albuquerque has a relatively small 900,000 people in its metro region, a smaller economy, and no major league sports teams. And this isn't to say that New Mexico and Albuquerque aren't growing. They definitely are. Between 1970 and 2010, New Mexico grew by double digits every single decade. That's pretty phenomenal growth that many states would envy. But compared to its neighbor Arizona, it's peanuts. New Mexico is a phenomenal state that has a lot going for it today, but it's had a unique set of challenges that's led to some rather anemic growth over the 20th century. Challenges its neighbor Arizona didn't have quite as much of. And because of those challenges, so many more people continue to move to Arizona over New Mexico today. I hope you enjoyed learning about why so many Americans choose to move to Arizona over New Mexico. If you did, please subscribe to my channel. And if you want to watch more of my videos, you can do so here. Thanks for watching. See you next time.